各位，今天是3月27日，星期四。现在我在首都国际机场第3航站楼。
Today is Thursday, March 27, and I'm at Terminal 3 of Beijing Capital International Airport. This airport was once among the busiest in the world, crowded with people, shoulder to shoulder. You could barely find an empty seat. But just look around now. Store after store is either closed or out of business. The current scene is bleak. Even at the state-run duty-free shop, there are more staff than customers. What does that say? It shows how strong our service mindset is. VIP service with no wait times. Just to clarify, it's the afternoon, not the middle of the night. So, what do we take away from walking around here? If this is what booming looks like, then saying China's growth is at 5% this year feels too modest. I say we could easily hit 10%. The vlogger sarcastically referred to the current economic decline as booming and mocked the official 5% GDP growth target, suggesting it was too modest. He expressed doubt about the official forecast, implying that the situation is worse than reported, and ironically suggested the growth figure of 10%.
倒闭了，全倒闭了，看看，我的妈，这全倒了，你看这。
Everything's shut down. My goodness, it's all gone. Just look at the entire mall. On a single floor, only 2 or 3 stores are still open, and the rest are closed. The place is practically deserted. It's honestly pretty alarming. The banquet hall, the hot pot restaurant, they've all closed. Zuishan Hai Seafood Hot Pot, Shangling Xiao Pu, they're gone too. These were large storefronts, and setting one up probably cost over $1,000,000 yuan. Now, nearly every business here has shut down. This is Weiyo Outlets. When it first opened, it was buzzing with activity, but now, around 60% of the stores are gone. The negative effects of downgraded consumption have become evident. After the Chinese New Year, physical stores have seen business drop to an all-time low. Entire food streets, lined with dozens of shops, are completely empty with no customers in sight. It's understandable that those without money aren't spending, but even those who can afford it are also holding back. The business environment has become increasingly challenging.
这回得劲儿了吧？饭店没人吃，商场没人逛。
Well now, this is just great, isn't it? No one's eating out, no one's shopping, no one's going to the markets, houses aren't selling, car dealerships are yelling themselves hoarse, but still no one's coming. And you're still talking about stimulating consumption? Isn't this stimulating enough already? Look, if farmers have no money, how are you going to stimulate anything? And you keep looking down on us rural folks. If we had money, we wouldn't need your stimulus plans. We would know how to spend it ourselves. It's not that we don't know how to enjoy life, it's that we don't have the money. If we had the money, you wouldn't need to teach us on how to enjoy life. It's like making a starving donkey pull a millstone for 3 days and handing the feed to some landlord just watching the show. The government's out there yelling at people to spend money, and the next second, they cut your health insurance or slice your pension in half. Companies treat workers like rags, use them, then toss them. Housing, education, and healthcare, these 3 crushing burdens are squeezing people so hard they can barely breathe. Their pockets are empty, and you want them to spend their lives to stimulate consumption?
这工资啊都不发，怎么提振消费？
If wages aren't being paid, how can we expect to boost consumer spending? I went back to Guiyang a few days ago and had conversations with several friends working in the public sector. What I found was troubling. Many of them haven't received their salaries in 4 to 6 months. Let's be clear, if even public sector workers aren't being paid, then the core drivers of consumer spending are essentially gone. One friend of mine isn't in a particularly critical role, so his pay was cut off. He's now making ends meet by freelancing, using his professional skills to cover basic expenses. His supervisors know, but they just turn a blind eye. But that's not even the most concerning part. Some companies in Guiyang owe over 20 million yuan in unpaid wages, yet they still rank among the top 50 in the city in terms of revenue. So if the goal is to stimulate consumption, the focus shouldn't be on issuing loans or relying on major private firms. Start by ensuring people are actually paid. If salaries aren't being paid, and you're handing out loans so people can spend money they don't have, that's not a strategy. That's a joke. Despite China's 1.4 billion population, domestic demand is no longer being driven effectively. The reason business is becoming increasingly difficult is that there is no money. In June of last year, retail sales of consumer goods nationwide grew by only 2% year on year. First-tier cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen fared even worse, with negative growth rates. This indicates that consumer weakness is no longer confined to smaller cities. It has spread to core economic regions. The oversupply of goods and insufficient demand has intensified competition, forcing businesses to deal with lower profit margins and higher operational costs. The impact of the real estate market is also a major factor. Years of high housing prices and excessive leverage have tied up much of the people's wealth in property. Mortgage pressure has significantly reduced disposable income. It's not just the ordinary consumers who are struggling. Even middle and high-income groups are cutting back on spending due to lower asset liquidity and more cautious outlooks on the economy. This reduction in what's known as the wealth effect is directly impacting domestic consumption. Additionally, rising costs have become another critical challenge. Ongoing increases in rent, labor, and raw material prices, combined with a shrinking consumer market, are squeezing profits from both sides. As a result, many businesses have been forced to shut down. The withdrawal of foreign investment has further intensified this downward spiral. As market returns fall and business confidence weakens, investment declines, job opportunities diminish, and household incomes come under great pressure. With limited funds, people are reluctant to spend, reinforcing a cycle that continues to suppress consumption. To help stimulate spending, China's National Financial Regulatory Administration issued a policy on March 21st aiming at encouraging consumption. The measures include easing loan requirements, increasing borrowing limits, extending repayment periods, and lowering interest rates. For example, the maximum amount of personal consumption loans has been raised from 300,000 yuan, approximately 41,000 US dollars, to 500,000 yuan, approximately 69,000 US dollars. And the limit for personal internet loans has increased from 200,000 yuan to 300,000 yuan. Loan terms have also been extended from a maximum of 5 years to 7 years. Most notably, bank loan interest rates may now be reduced to as low as 2.5%. Suddenly, it seemed like banks were inviting people to take out loans. The thresholds were so low, it almost felt like the loans didn't need to be repaid. Some individuals wasted no time in borrowing aggressively. Some took out consumption loans to make down payments on homes, while others used low-interest loans to buy bank wealth management products. Some transferred loan funds to stock market accounts, while others invested in virtual currencies or used the loans to pay off credit card debt, eventually falling into a borrow-to-pay-back cycle. On social media, some even planned to use these loans to speculate on Bitcoin. A few individuals, facing serious health conditions like cancer, took out loans from multiple banks to indulge themselves before their situation worsened. The introduction of low-interest consumer loans, with rates below 3%, led to widespread chaos within just 10 days, prompting regulatory authorities to step in and halt the policy. On March 31st, several banks received regulatory notices instructing them to halt the approval of consumer loans with annualized interest rates below 3%. This new rule took effect on April 1st. The big question is, why did China's regulatory stance shift so dramatically? Firstly, as these loans increased, the central bank and regulatory authorities were bound to intervene. The original intent of the new consumer loan policy was to stimulate consumption. However, in practice, it has turned into what some now see as a cash machine. Instead of flowing into the real economy, the funds are being used for wealth management, stock trading, and even for repaying loans, clearly straying from the policy's original goal. Secondly, the dual threat of financial inefficiency and rising bad debt risks has prompted both regulators and banks to take action. Let's take a closer look at the numbers to understand how serious the issue is. Suppose a loan of 1 million yuan is issued at an annual interest rate of 2.5%, and the bank's funding cost is 1.5%. The resulting interest margin is 1%, meaning the bank earns 10,000 yuan in net interest income per year. However, if the non-performing loan rate reaches 1%, 10,000 yuan of the loan will not be repaid. This would wipe out the interest income entirely, leaving the bank with a loss. At present, non-performing loan rates are rising across the banking sector. For example, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China reported an increase in the non-performing rate for personal business loans from 0.9% to 1.3%. If banks continue to issue low-interest loans, their capacity to manage financial risk will weaken further. In essence, the Chinese government faces a dilemma. On one hand, it is printing more money and encouraging borrowing. On the other, setting interest rates too low narrows the profit margin, potentially causing losses for banks and heightening risks to the broader financial system. According to 2024 annual reports, while the volume of consumer loans has grown substantially, the non-performing loan rate has also risen noticeably. In response, some banks have scaled back their retail lending to improve asset quality. For instance, Ping An Bank reduced its consumer loan balance by 13% in 2024. However, this also created operational pressure. On the consumer side, for individuals earning less than 5,000 yuan per month, repaying a 500,000 yuan loan, even over 7 years, would require nearly 6,000 yuan in monthly payments. This is clearly unrealistic. The situation is even more difficult for those already carrying mortgage or car loan obligations. Although banks have lowered interest rates in response to policy, they are not charitable organizations. Ultimately, the risk is transferred back to the banks. It may lead to a spike in non-performing loans. In other words, while low-interest loans may initially attract borrowers, if repayment capacity falls short and defaults accumulate, banks will bear the losses. On the surface, this policy appears to give the market a much-needed boost. However, the market's reaction has sparked a range of issues and controversies.
消费贷款能促进消费，这鬼话你能信吗？
Do you really believe consumer loans can boost spending? That's nonsense. From the 315 anti-fraud campaign cracking down on shady agents to today's deep interest rate cuts and increased consumer loan limits, every move signals the same problem. Domestic consumption is weak and needs a boost. That's what led to the so-called consumer loan reform that went viral online. But the reality is far less promising. Much of that loan money hasn't gone towards real consumption. Instead, it's flowed illegally into the housing and stock markets, used to repay debts, or funneled into investments. And let's be honest, the people eligible for consumer loans are most middle and high-income earners. Their daily consumption needs are already met, so they're using the funds for more asset allocation or luxury purchases, not basic day-to-day spending. Consumer loans are a temporary fix, a short-term lifeline meant for emergencies. What truly strengthens consumer power is building long-term capacity, creating jobs, expanding employment, raising income levels, cutting healthcare, retirement, and education costs, and broadening Social Security coverage. That's what will actually unlock consumer potential. That's how you truly stimulate spending. The WeChat account Norway Talk recently published a commentary stating that in an effort to boost consumption, Chinese authorities have chosen lending over cash handouts and wage increases. To meet the demand from authorities, banks quickly took action, first by extending loans to those who can't repay, and then by slashing interest rates to historic lows. The article highlights that the urgency of the Beijing authorities stems from the underperforming consumer market since the beginning of this year. Whether consumption is downgraded or not no longer matters. The real question is, why is no one going out to buy things? The article suggests that there are many ways to boost consumption. One common approach used by many economies is direct cash distribution, as the US government did during the pandemic. Another method, more aligned with China's circumstances, would be to raise pensions for rural retirees. Providing them with greater financial security could encourage them to spend both their savings and the money sent by their children. This approach could also help address the significant disparities in pension distribution among different demographic groups. At present, the central bank and financial regulators are likely under pressure from both directions. On one side, they must curb financial inefficiencies and prevent capital from flowing away from the real economy. On the other, they must contain the rising rate of non-performing loans to avoid excessive strain on the banking system. Raising interest rates is only the first step. Next, they may tighten loan approval criteria or restrict how consumer loans can be used. For example, by requiring funds to be directed towards traceable consumption categories. However, such measures could weaken the impact of the new policies, and the consumer market may still remain sluggish. The current consumer loan frenzy has exposed the awkward position of policymakers. While authorities are clearly eager to stimulate consumption, it seems they lack a cohesive top-down strategy, with various departments acting independently, which has added to the economic policy confusion. The central government has made boosting consumption a top priority for China's economy. This year, the long-standing growth model based on investment and exports will become increasingly unsustainable. Investment growth is slowing, particularly due to continued weakness in the real estate sector. Official data shows that from January to February this year, national real estate development investment totaled 1.1 trillion yuan, marking a 9.8% year-on-year decline. As a result, investment is contributing less to overall economic growth. Faced with these challenges, the Chinese Communist Party has been forced to shift its policy focus to stimulating domestic demand. On March 5th, during his government work report at the 14th National People's Congress, Premier Li Qiang mentioned consumption 32 times. He emphasized that boosting consumption and expanding domestic demand will be the CCP's top priority among its 10 key tasks for 2025. Despite the government's increased efforts to stimulate consumption, the results are being constrained by two key factors. First, inefficient income and low purchasing power, and second, a lack of consumer confidence and reluctance to spend. According to official data, China's GDP in 2023 was 126 trillion yuan, with per capita disposable income at 39,218 yuan, equivalent to about $5,400, and a population of around 1.4 billion. This means that disposable income as a percentage of GDP is approximately 43.9%, much lower than that of the US at 76%, the UK at 62%, and Japan at 54%. This indicates that residents have low income levels and insufficient purchasing power. On the other hand, Chinese residents have a very high savings rate. In 2023, it was 33.4%, far higher than the US at 4.5% and the UK at 6.1%. However, household final consumption expenditure accounted for only 39.1% of GDP. This high savings rate combined with low consumption share shows that people are pessimistic about the future economy, leading to increased savings and reduced spending willingness. Employment pressures and uncertain income expectations further drive people to tighten their wallets. Moreover, residents are under significant debt pressure, with their income not sufficient to cover repayments. By the end of 2023, China's total household debt amounted to 80 trillion yuan, including mortgages, consumer loans, and credit card debt. The total disposable income of residents was about 55.3 trillion yuan. This results in a debt-to-income ratio of 144.7% and a household debt-to-GDP ratio of 63.5%. With household debt capacity nearly exhausted, consumer loan volumes expanding, and non-performing loan rates rising, the Chinese government has chosen not to proactively increase public spending or leverage to ensure residents have stable incomes and improved expectations. Instead, it has allowed banks to assume greater risk by issuing more loans, pushing additional debt onto the public. Why is such a counterintuitive policy being implemented so openly? On March 31st, US-based China affairs expert Shi Shan told overseas media that the Chinese Communist Party controls China's economy and society through highly centralized political authority. As a result, policymakers tend to rely on administrative orders to resolve economic challenges, rather than using market mechanisms to stimulate vitality. The rollout of the consumer loan policy reflects the same top-down logic. Shi Shan noted that consumer loans merely encourage residents to borrow against future income, without resolving the root problem of insufficient demand. Sustainable consumption can only be achieved by raising incomes, improving social security, and resorting to public confidence, not by encouraging households to increase leverage and overspend. This reliance on short-term debt as an administrative remedy is, in essence, a self-destructive strategy. Simply put, a debt-fueled model for economic survival is not sustainable.